Today from the global lane, sudden death syndrome. It's no longer only babies. Working people and young athletes are suddenly dropping dead.
We have a health problem, a national health crisis. Unfortunately, the vaccine is a taboo subject. On Wall Street, when we see statistics like this, we become quite alarmed.
Donald Trump arrested and booked. How Americans can overcome the great political, racial, and cultural divide.
What we need are bridge builders. Instead of left, instead of right, how do we go higher?
Celebrating resurrection this Easter. Doing a distraction and negativity detox to live a victorious life.
When Jesus left the tomb, he left the grave clothes behind. He stepped out in spirit. And that's what God's asking us to do. Leave those grave clothes behind and live in the resurrection of Christ.
And overcoming 60 years of American presidential destruction. And it's all right here on the global lane. Sudden death among healthy working age people worldwide is skyrocketing. Here in America, it was up 40% during the third and fourth quarters of 2021. Our next guest contends a 10% jump would have been a 1 in 200 year event, but this was 40%. Edward Dowd is a founding partner of Finance Technologies and author of the new book, Cause Unknown, The Epidemic of Sudden Deaths in 2021 and 2022. Okay, Edward, most people would respond to this sudden death news and say the statistics jumped 40% because of COVID-19. What do you say?
Yeah, so in 2020, it was mostly old folks who died of COVID with comorbidities. Then there was a sudden mix shift in 2021 and 22 and continues in 23. And my work and my partner's work points to something that happened with the employed of our country. It's been detrimental to your health to be employed in 21 and 22. And we examined the Society of Actuaries, which is an industry group for insurers that does surveys. In August of 22, they came out with a survey for their group life policyholders. And group life is a specific policy for those who onboard to Fortune 500 or mid-sized companies. You get this death benefit as kind of a freebie when you onboard, and you get 1 or 2 extra salary. Should you die, you get that, your family gets that, or your beneficiary. You have to be employed at the time you get it. Well, this is a great business for insurance companies. And in 2021, the whole industry experienced 40% excess death in ages 25 through 64. The millennials, 25 through 44, were hard hit particularly. The group life policyholders generally die at 1/3 the rate of the general U.S. population in any given year. And in 2021, I just said they had 40% excess death. The general U.S. population had 32% excess death.
Well, it seems like, tell us about some of these unexpected sudden deaths. It seems like there are a lot of them. I mean, just from a Google search, you can find like a lot of 12, 14, 16, 18-year-olds that are just dropping dead suddenly. Tell us more.
Right. Right. And in my book, I talk about sudden death, and we look at the sudden deaths of athletes, which, did it happen before 21? It did. There was a study in 2006 by the Lausanne Institute in Switzerland that showed over the course of 38 years, they found 1,101 sudden athletic deaths, which is about 29 a year globally. We'd be lucky to have a month with just 29 since 2021. In my book alone, there's hundreds and hundreds of examples. So something's changed. I obviously blame the vaccine because that's what's changed in mandates. And, the naysayers will tell me it's COVID, long COVID. Well, if that's the case, why did it not affect the young in 2020? And so we have a health problem, a national health crisis, and at the very least, it should be examined and discussed openly. Unfortunately, the vaccine is a taboo subject, and it's not allowed to be discussed in the mainstream media or pretty much anywhere near health authorities. So this is a problem that needs to be reckoned with. We need a national discussion about it. And, if I'm proven wrong, that's great. But unfortunately, on Wall Street, when we see statistics like this, and trend changes like this, we become quite alarmed. And that's what I do for a living.
Yeah, it gets your attention. And I want to remind people that you're not a medical doctor, but you've done a lot of research on this for your book. So what did medical professionals speculate is the probable cause of all these sudden deaths? Do they agree with you?
Well, it depends on where you fall down on the issue. Obviously, the frontline doctors who were vilified early on, who identified the vaccine issues, like Peter McCullough, Dr. Malone, and others agree with me. The excuses I've heard from many medical professionals is, well, there's suicides, Ed. There's drug and fentanyl overdoses and missed cancer screening appointments. Well, let's take a look at what happened in the third quarter of 2021. The millennial group, according to the Society of Actuaries, that's ages 25 through 44, experienced into the third quarter a rise from about 30% excess mortality to 84%. Very sudden, rapid change. So I call that an event. I call that the mandate event in the fall of 2021. And to say that Fortune 500 and mid-sized company employees had a suicide pact doesn't make any sense to me. To get your claim, you have to keep your job. Fentanyl users and heroin users don't stay employed very long, and it's also suspicious they decided to overdose in the same quarter. And then the missed cancer screening appointments doesn't make any sense. I'm 56, never had one. It's something that young folks don't tend to do. So this is, and for all three to have occurred simultaneously is nearly impossible. So there is an event that occurred in 2021. If the doctors can explain that to me, we had already gone from the original Wuhan variant to Delta, and Delta didn't seem to do this damage in the summer, and Delta was all over the place in the summer. So somebody needs to investigate this. I have my definitive conclusion. In my estimation, it's the vaccine. I'll be proven wrong until, and right now I don't have anybody coming up with an excuse that makes any sense to me or anybody else, quite frankly.
Okay, the book is Cause Unknown, The Epidemic of Sudden Deaths in 2021 and 2022. Edward Dodd, thank you for sharing those insights. We appreciate it. The indictment and arrest of former President Donald Trump have created a deep political divide in America. Leftists are elated, many conservatives outraged. So what is the way forward beyond politics? How can the people of the United States recover from deep political and cultural wounds? Well, joining us from Washington is Dr. David Anderson. He's a pastor, author, and founder of Gracism Global, an organization that bridges cultural, faith, race, and wealth divides in American society. So, David, thank you for being here. How should Christians respond to this unprecedented indictment and arrest of a former president who's also the leading opposition candidate to the current president of the United States?
Well, thank you, Gary, for having me on today. There's definitely no glory in former President Trump being arrested or turning himself in and having charges against him. So there's no glory in that kind of an indictment. And I think the way we respond as believers is soberly, with humility, and with temperance, regardless of what side of the political aisle you may find yourself on.
It's all about grace, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So no matter what happens, these wounds are deep. They won't disappear anytime soon. Family members and friends are divided over this, just as they were over the COVID pandemic. So how can we heal? Is it too soon to even think about reconciliation?
I think healing is important, not only politically, but culturally, racially. There's a lot of division, and that division was exposed and leveraged, and still is exposed and leveraged. The former president had a lot to do with that, stoking that. And then you have Democrats on the other side stoking it. And so if you have a lot of agitators or instigators, then it's just going to cause the wounds to continue to unfortunately hurt us. And so what we need are bridge builders, and we need healers to say, listen, I understand both sides, but how can we go forward? Instead of left, instead of right, how do we go higher? And I think that's what we're called to as believers.
And that's where churches come forward too, or should come forward, right? So there is division in Black and Hispanic communities over support for Donald Trump, and we've seen tweets where some African Americans are being called Uncle Toms or traitors to their race because of it. And so we're not only seeing racial divisions between races, but also within various racial groups. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, it's always difficult if you're a part of a minority group that has been oppressed historically, not to look at those who might be carrying a more minority view for the civil rights of that group to feel a certain kind of way. Having said that, if you're a gracist, if you're someone that's extending positive favor, then if you're a part of that racial group, for me, as an African American, the grace in me should say there's room enough for people who may not agree with maybe the majority of those who have fought for our civil rights for so long. And so we've got to make sure that as a people, our tent is big enough to celebrate all the different voices, even if we don't always agree.
Culturally, there are a lot of parents upset about the sexualization of children. Books and course instruction advancing an LGBTQ agenda in public schools, so our society is also polarized on the issue of abortion. How can there be reconciliation on traditional values issues?
Well, those values are so very important to us, right? To say what is marriage and what is life. So I think that those are important questions. What we have to ask is, how do you get to the bottom line of getting less abortions? How do you get to the bottom line of saying this is what God's ideal is, but this is the real that we live in? Bridge builders try to build a bridge between the real and the ideal. And there's some people who, whether you say one man, one woman for one lifetime, they may agree, but that's not their reality. They have divorced parents. They have a spouse that divorced them or that cheated, or they may feel attracted to to someone of the same sex. And so here's the ideal, but this is their real. To be a pastor, to be a Christian, to be a follower of Christ, go where the real is and help build a bridge to where their ideal is. But when you politicize it, now we have to talk about, so what does that agenda look like in school? What does that agenda look like in the law? But bridge builders are always trying to build a bridge from the real to the ideal.
And quickly, what about gracism? What is it? Why is it important?
Well, I've mentioned being a gracist. You know, gracism is about extending positive favor to people, regardless of, maybe even because of, their color, class, or culture. So gracism is this new term that emerges that says, how do we extend grace to people, whether they deserve it or not, whether they earn it or not, whether they can repay it or not? And God is the biggest gracist of us all. He extended grace to another race, even though we didn't deserve it. And that's what brought reconciliation between God and man. I think gracism is God's solution to racism. And if we would extend that kind of grace with regard to all of the different divisions we've been talking about, I believe that God can bring the healing that we all desire.
Okay, Dr. David Anderson, pastor, author, and your most recent book is Gracism, The Art of Inclusion. Thank you for being with us. We appreciate it.
God bless you, Gary. Thank you.
Thousands of Christians worldwide are expected to make the annual pilgrimage to Jerusalem this year for Good Friday and Easter. It's a time to celebrate the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, when he removed his grave clothes and conquered death and the sins of the world. Although Christians profess faith in him, many of us still carry the burden of past hurts, disappointments, and regret. Our next guest says it's time to remove our grave clothes and live the victorious life that God has destined for us. Billy Jouse is a public speaker, best-selling author, and host of the popular Family Room podcast. Her latest book is Distraction Detox. Billy, thank you for being with us to share your thoughts during this key time for Christians worldwide. And although Christians believe in Christ, many are still chained to the hurts and burdens of the past and present struggles. So why is that? I thought we're supposed to live a joyful life in Christ.
Thank you for having me with you. I went through a time where I felt like I was spiritually stagnant. Still loved Jesus, still doing good things, but I was just overwhelmed with a lot of the thoughts that I was having, the negative thinking that was holding me back from doing what I knew God desired me to do, which was to pursue him. And we hold on to those things from the past, from the present. That one little thing someone said to us so many years ago can send us into a spiral of negative thinking.
Now, you write about a distraction detox. So what is that, and what do we need to do to live a more victorious life here?
Yeah. So I go through the process, and I never write a book that the Lord hasn't dragged me through, because I don't always go willingly in times of when the Lord wants to transform me. So I had done a lot of, my schedule was simplified. My youngest son was had graduated from high school. I was an empty nester chasing my husband around the U.S. because he's a professional baseball coach and we travel a lot. But I found that I was distracted from spending time with God, and I really wanted to dig into that. Even though I had more time on my plate, I wasn't taking time.
Well, many Christians will spend maybe 3 hours at church each week, but hours each day at home on smartphones, tablets. We're addicted to our electronic devices. It's probably harder for younger people than it is for most boomers. So how do we put those things down, focus on God, engage with people beyond the electronics and four walls of our homes?
Yeah, I find myself getting distracted with electronics. I'm not young anymore. Let's just say that. So I find myself getting distracted and spending time until, I'm scrolling on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, news stories, ESPN, whatever it may be for that moment. And so we do that. We get distracted. But when I look at why am I doing that, it's because I'm avoiding something else. I'm avoiding thinking about something. I'm avoiding of tackling something. I don't feel like I can do what God's calling me to do, so I distract myself. So that's where we can dig into those emotional toxins, determining what they are. What is it that's keeping us on our phone all those hours, rather than digging into God's word or spending time with other people?
Easter, like most holidays, can be a lonely time for those without family or friends. How do we overcome loneliness and feelings of worthlessness or insignificance?
Yeah, the thing about being lonely is, being in professional baseball, I've found myself in a stadium of 35,000 people and still feeling lonely. And I had to think about, why am I feeling lonely when I've got 35,000 people around me, and some that are close enough to me and in my baseball family that are sitting next to me. And that's where I came into, I'm the one that's creating that barrier or that wall. I'm afraid that they're not going to like me, or I'm not going to add up to what they think I should, or I doubt that I can be a good friend to them. And breaking down those emotional toxins is where we can start believing that God can use us even in the smallest places that we are, to step out in faith. And once we get rid of those negative emotional toxins, we're able to move into places that we can hear God calling us, pulling us into situations where we're not so lonely anymore, because we're putting ourselves around other people. We're being vulnerable. We're being transparent. We're opening our lives up to be able to have a connection with other people. You talk about the grave clothes, and that's something I talk about in the book, that when Jesus left the tomb, he left the grave clothes behind. He stepped out in spirit. And that's what God's asking us to do. Leave those grave clothes behind and live in the resurrection of Christ. He has come to give us life, and give us life to the fullest in him, not in material things, not in number of things, but to give us fullness in him. And that's where he desires us to step into. So when we leave those grave clothes behind, those negative thoughts of not being good enough, for fear of not fitting in, comparing our lives to others, that shame and guilt that we should have never carried past the forgiveness we asked God for, and moving into where God desires us to be.
Okay, the book is Distraction Detox. Billy Joust, thank you for being with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
This week, Donald Trump became the first former president to be indicted and arrested. But this should come of no surprise to those familiar with recent American history. You see, we've been on a long, painstaking journey to destroy the effectiveness of our presidents. Once called the imperial presidency, those who now occupy the office are all but imperial. The real power has shifted away from the Oval Office to the bureaucracy and the big money interests that control our Congress. No longer is our nation of the people, by the people, and for the people. Let me give you a brief look at what has transpired during the lifetimes of most baby boomers. During his farewell address, President Eisenhower warned the nation to beware of the military-industrial complex. Less than 3 years later, JFK was assassinated in Dallas. Today, most Americans believe organized crime and intelligence assets within the U.S. government conspired to murder the president. 20 years later, another presidency is destroyed. Not by bullets, but by Democrats in the Washington Post. Richard Nixon obstructed justice in the Watergate affair and became the first president forced from office.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
Republicans get even. 24 years later, Bill Clinton is impeached for obstructing justice and lying to a federal grand jury.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky.
21 years later, Donald J. Trump is impeached. A year later, he's impeached again, becoming the first U.S. president to be impeached twice. And now on April 4th, 2023, Trump, the leading opposition candidate to Joe Biden, is arrested. JFK assassination, Nixon resignation, Clinton impeachment, Trump impeachment again, and now arrest. Do you see the 60-year pattern here? Voters are no longer choosing our presidents. Someone else is. Folks, our nation cannot survive if we continue down this path. It's the politics of presidential assassination, no longer by bullets, but through media manipulation and the criminal justice system. Yes, many years have passed since Watergate, but our nation is still being destroyed by this political poison. And who knows what will become of Joe Biden, the oldest U.S. president in history. His son and possibly other family members are under investigation for an alleged pay-to-play scheme involving the Chinese and other foreign business partners. So what do we do to reverse the trend? I have 3 two-word statements for you. The first, term limits. Folks, we need to limit the time members of Congress are allowed to serve. Term limits will go a long way to limit special interest influence. The second is age limits. We need leaders that demonstrate incisive cognitive abilities. And finally, righteous leaders. We need to elect people of faith who exemplify godliness in government and prioritize serving the people over money and mammon. Well, that's it today from the Global Lane. Be sure to follow us on the CBN News and NRB channels, Twitter, YouTube, Rumble, and our broadcast affiliates. And until next time, happy Easter. Be blessed.